I was just in the middle of tuning my fiddle. Do you mind if I tune it?
Really quick? Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. All right. So hi.
Hi.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Estrin. More Than Enough is April Halprin Wayland's new picture book about Passover. In our Skype conversation, April talked about her writing, about National Poetry Month, and she spoke movingly about being present and about the importance of gratitude. She also played the fiddle for us. Be sure to check the Book of Life website at bookoflifepodcast.com for links to the many, many resources that came up in our conversation.
April, welcome back to the genre of Jewish Kidlit. I just want to remind listeners that your first Jewish picture book was New Year at the Pier in 2009, which was a Rosh Hashanah story that won the Sidney Taylor Book Award.
I was totally floored that it won the Sidney Taylor Award. It was one of the most wonderful things that happened to me in my literary life. And I stumbled into the area of Jewish literature because I love Tashlich so much, and I wanted to write about how we celebrated it in an ocean town.
So, give us a quick summary of your new book, More Than Enough.
More Than Enough centers on the Dayenu song in Passover. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Dayenu is a wonderful, catchy, very child-friendly song, and the refrain is basically the word Dayenu over and over and over again, and that word means it would have sufficed, it would have been enough. So, for example, if we had only been freed from slavery, Dayenu, that would have been enough. Or if we had only had the Red Sea parted, that would have been enough. So it's sort of being present and aware of the blessings we have at this moment. So what I wanted to do was take that philosophy, which is, across cultures, across philosophies, across religions in the world, and make it accessible to little kids. The story itself is a family going to a farmer's market and getting food for Passover, preparing haroset, one of the traditional Passover dishes, then going to Nana's house and sharing in the traditional ritual meal, including all the fun things that happen, and then finally having a sleepover at Nana's. That's the essence of the story. And every page, after they have a moment at the farmer's market, Dayenu. So when you're reading it to a child, it's really fun because you can read the page and they always have a part. They can say Dayenu.
I understand that this was not a Jewish story to begin with. So can you tell us the story behind that, how the book evolved?
Right. We were in Kauai, Hawaii, so it was my 20-something-year-old son and his new girlfriend who we really liked, and my husband and myself. And we were hiking up a particularly tricky hike that was challenging. The kids were sprinting ahead. They're very fit. And I was going to myself, if I can just make it up to this hill, Dayenu, if I can. And then I'd look over to the top and I'd see this gorgeous kind of a layered of turquoise blue and green ocean. And I thought, if I just see this view, I don't need to go down and swim. And if I don't go down to swim, this is enough, Dayenu. And it sort of amused me. So I thought of it that whole day. And I came home and wrote that sort of a prayer, sort of a story from the point of view of an adult. And I read it at Passover, at a friend's Passover meal. And there was a lot of encouragement. They really liked it. And I thought, maybe this can be a children's story. So I revised it as a hike for about a 7-year-old in Hawaii from the point of view of each moment being precious. So I turned it into my editor, the same editor at Dial who published New Year at the Pier, a Rosh Hashanah story. And she said, great, we really like it. And I said, fabulous. And she said, could you take it out of Hawaii? And I said, okay. And I was a little sad because one of the reasons I liked that it was in Hawaii was because it meant to me that it could be anywhere. But okay, I really have never mentioned Hawaii in the book, except I mentioned when they were hiking, there was red dirt. So I thought, okay, there's red dirt in California. It could be anywhere. Then she said, this is great. We really like it. We especially like the farmer's market at the end of the hike. Can you expand on that? I said, okay, and I did. And then she said, and, instead of them buying ahi tuna and mangoes, could they be buying foods for Passover? And I thought, okay. So I changed that. And then she said, and these days, the books that really work best are those, instead of for 3 to 8-year-olds, which was the formerly popular picture book age, we're really seeing that the sales are going to 3 to 5-year-olds. So can you make it much, much younger with many fewer words? And I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be hard because I've never worked with this age group. But I did. And she said, okay, well, that's great. Could they be preparing food for Passover at the end? And I said, okay. I was going, wait, okay, really? Okay. And then she said, could they be going to Nana's afterwards, carrying one of the foods? And I was at a children's conference in Mississippi that day, and I was listening to a particularly dynamic, inspiring speaker who said, don't sacrifice your art. You need to do exactly what you need to do. Don't let them change you. And I was all like up in arms, almost with like a protest civil rights song, head. And it was like midnight, and I fired off an email to my agent saying, we need to pull this book. This is not the book I intended to write. I intended to write a book that was universal. And she said, call me. So the next day I called her, and she basically talked me off the cliff. She said, this in and of itself is a wonderful book, April. You can't see that. And yes, you're right. You had a specific vision. But this is what the meshing of business and art is. This is what you do to get your stuff out in the world. And I love my agent. So I said, okay. And basically I did about 38 revisions from the time my book, which is just 200 and something words, was turned in to the time that it was published. There were about 38 revisions. The hardest part for me was that, as you know, Heidi, anytime there are 2 Jews in a room, there are 3 opinions. So they had me define terms, which I had a cultural understanding of, but I wanted to make sure I was exact. And I had these 3 experts that I was constantly sending my manuscripts to, and no one could agree. It was really tricky in writing that glossary. And even we originally had pronunciations, and we took them out because people couldn't agree on how to pronounce things. So, yeah, that was how the book was birthed. But I think if you ask any author, they all have stories like this.
Well, it's funny because the book is so simple and flows so easily, you wouldn't expect it to have had such a difficult beginning.
Yeah. And when you asked how I wrote it, I did copy the whole Dayenu song in English. I looked at the poetry pattern and tried to match that for a while. And then I thought, it's just much more complicated than I want to be. So the only thing I matched was I tried to have the word Dayenu as a refrain. But thank you for saying that it feels like it was effortless. That's every artist's dream.
Right. Yeah, you can't see all the work. So which elements from the original are still in the final book?
Well, the word Dayenu. I think at the very end of one of the early versions, they did adopt a kitten at the farmer's market in the animal rescue booth. And early on, my editor asked if we could possibly remove the cat. And I like to have an animal in all my books. That's something that's important to me. I think it's a fun secondary story for kids to watch, even if the cat never plays an important part in the story. And so one of my dear friends who's Jewish and was one of my experts said, why don't you tell them that they're freeing the Jews from slavery? It's symbolic when they take the cat out of the cage.
Oh.
So I told them that, and they said, oh, okay, well, then you need to leave it in. So we did. But pretty much everything else was changed. There's a well-known metaphorical story about editing. Do you want to hear that?
Sure.
So a woman buys a vase and she loves it. She buys it at an art show and she comes home and she puts it on her mantle, and then she realizes that the green of the vase, it does not match the green of her wall. So she has that wall painted the exact green, and then she realizes that therefore her couch doesn't really work because it's the wrong green too, so she has that reupholstered. And then she realizes that other things clash, and she finally sort of completely redesigns her whole living room. And when she's done, the one thing that doesn't actually work is the vase, and she takes it out of the room. And that was pretty much my experience.
That's a good story. I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah.
So while this book obviously ties in with Passover, it almost seems like a book to use at Thanksgiving. It seems like something that can be used beyond Passover. Is that how you see it?
I absolutely do. And in fact, do you know who Antoinette Portis is? She wrote Not a Box.
Oh, yes.
So she's a dear friend, and one of her books that recently came out is called Wait. It's only about 4 words in the whole book, and the concept is that a mother and her child are running out of the house. They're clearly late for something. And she's running, holding his hand. They're on a sidewalk in a city, and she's saying, hurry. And then he says, wait. And you turn the page, and he points to a flower that's sprouting through the cement. And then she says, hurry, hurry. And he says, wait. And he's pointing to some ducks in the park. The story goes on like this until the very end. She says, hurry. And he pulls her jacket, and she looks at him, and they miss the train. And he says, wait. And he points. And you turn the page, and there's a double rainbow, and she said, yes, wait. And to me, that's my book. Any book where you're trying to stop the influences we have today, the cacophony.
So do you think it's particularly important in today's busy climate to have picture books remind parents and kids that they need to pause?
I do, and I think you said it right, parents and kids, because the parents are going to be reading this to the kids, and it needs to be woven into the fabric of the day, beginning with the modeling from the parent. I am so grateful I did not have a cell phone when my son was growing up, because I am like a dog with a squirrel. You know, I'm very attracted to lights and bings and pings, and it would be tough to be raised by a mom who's constantly distracted. I live in Los Angeles, and we drive a lot. And the 2 things that I do right now that are helping me, besides meditating, when I'm driving, my rule is that for 10 minutes during my drive, I turn off the radio. And I just am driving, which is really hard. 10 minutes is a long time to be just going, wow, I'm in traffic. This is the steering wheel. That's the sky. But it's also so, you can just feel your body relax. And the other thing I have is that in the middle of the day, I have a little alarm that rings on my phone. And it just reminds me that whatever I'm doing right now, would it be possible to just stop and plant my feet on the ground and be present? And that really helps.
Wow, so you take mindfulness very seriously. You've got specific practices that you're doing regularly.
I have to. For example, one of my friends taught me how to meditate. And she said to me one day, April, I think we're going to have to put a stone on each corner of your meditation rug to keep you on earth while you're meditating. Because I'm just, my brain, probably a lot of us, there's so many squirrels running around and it's so much a loud circus that to be present and quiet is so lovely. So that, it's as much a message for me as I was writing it as for anyone.
This book is about mindfulness, and it's also about gratitude. So they're not exactly the same thing,
no,
but they're related. Do you think one is necessary for the other?
That's an interesting question. No, I suppose you could be mindful and really grumpy. I suppose you could go, I am here right now and it's a lousy day, and maybe there's nothing wrong with admitting that.
What about the other direction, though?
Yes, the other direction is you could be mindful, and that could also help you change the channel and how you have been thinking.
But do you think you can be grateful without being mindful?
I'm going to just speak for me. Every night I write to a friend and I tell her about my day, and I end it with 5 things that I'm grateful for. And I've since read that when you do that, it changes your body chemistry. So when I think about what I'm grateful for, it really makes me stop. It forces me to be present and go, what are you grateful for? That's it. I don't think I can be grateful without stopping and being present. Can you?
think you probably need to be at least a little bit mindful.
Yeah.
To be grateful.
Yeah.
Although, as you say, I think you could be the other way. You could be mindful and not grateful, but I don't think you could be grateful and not mindful.
If you set out to go, what am I grateful for? I think it kind of turns the channel to your grateful and present channel.
Well, let's try it right now. Why not? So let's pause for a moment. Do you have your noise? Can you make it? That's a pretty piece of music. Do you know what it is?
It's called Warm Greetings on Galaxy, and I went looking for different sounds. Okay. I wake up to birds chirping.
Oh, nice. Okay, so in the moment while we were listening to that music, were you being mindful?
Here's what I'm mindful of. I'm in bare feet, and I'm in my upstairs room on some really comfortable carpet in the sun. And I can feel the carpet under my feet, and it feels really great. I'm really grateful that the sound worked on Skype because sometimes it doesn't on this laptop. And I'm mindful that I'm healthy. And also, it is April 5th, 2016, and my husband's an accountant, so I get to see him on April 18th.
So not too long
Not too long
to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
What about you?
Yeah, I noticed that the room I'm in is a little too warm right now.
Uh-huh.
And I'm looking across the table and seeing a flower that my friend gave me for my birthday, and it's still blooming, an orchid.
When was your birthday?
And my birthday was in late February, but orchids last a long time.
Yes, wow.
So it still has one flower on it. And I'm feeling grateful, as you say, that Skype worked, because you can't count on that.
No.
And I'm grateful to have this podcast that's been going for 10 years, which is amazing, because it gives me an excuse to have these interesting conversations with people that I would not otherwise have.
You know, and I'm really grateful that you have them, too. I learned so much.
Cool. All right, that was really interesting. So I found a lot of great background about this book on the Teaching Authors website, which is a project of yours. So can you tell about the website?
Yeah, Teaching Authors began 7 years ago on April 22nd. It was started by Carmilla Martino in Chicago and 5 other children's authors. There were going to be 6 of them, and then one of them suddenly couldn't contribute. So somebody knew somebody who knew me, and I was in California, and everybody else was either in the Midwest or the East Coast. So they reached across the country and asked if I would like to join. And my first thought was, I don't really know what a blog is. And the second thought is, I don't have time to blog, whatever it is. My third thought was, I should learn. So my feeling inside was, I'll do this for a year, and then I'll gently tiptoe away and say thank you. And we are now celebrating our 7th year together. We have some teaching author blogsters who will take a sabbatical and will fill in with someone else, but they're always coming back in and coming back out. And our audience, we believe, are writing teachers, aspiring writers, other writers, poets, students, homeschooled kids, and their teachers. We do author interviews, we have book giveaways, and we'll talk about different topics we want to work on, and then every person will take that topic and do their own riff on it. For example, right now the topic is Poetry Month and also Poem in Your Pocket Day. So people can talk about that, but they can talk about anything they want to. Sometimes we have what we call Wednesday writing workouts, WWWs, and actually I just wrote one, and it's about patterns in our lives and patterns in poetry, and how to copy a poem and make that pattern your own for your own poem. Any possible topic that writers, like writer's block, we have covered topics about rewriting. It's really fun, and I find it incredibly enriching and a very different kind of writing than writing fiction. So I have to write for a deadline, and whether it's perfect or not, it's up.
So as you mentioned, it's National Poetry Month right now.
Right.
So talk about your own connection to poetry.
I always wrote poetry, as many teenage girls do. I recently heard a really interesting podcast called Note to Self. NPR had an opportunity where you could describe to them for a week. And they talked about being overwhelmed by technology and how to take control over it. And I thought, okay, I could do that for a week. So in this week, what they did is they asked you to pick a goal. Then every day they would check in either with text or with email to see if you were more on target, if you needed help. But they also had like a 10-minute podcast where they would interview neuroscientists about how technology and your brain interact. So one of the interviews said that when you label a feeling, when you write about it, just that contains it. Just that begins to tame the feeling. So I think as a teenager, that's exactly what I was doing. I was trying to tame those uncontrollable, hugely passionate feelings, the confusion that, churns in your body at that age. And one big moment in our family life was I grew up during the Vietnam War, and there was a fabulous photographic book called Vietnam, Vietnam. It's an iconic book it's an orange cover, and the picture on the cover is of a nude little girl running away, and her back is on flames from napalm that we bombed in the war. And as a 14-year-old girl, when I read that book, when I looked at the pictures, I was nauseated and horrified, and my brain exploded. So I sat down and wrote a poem about my horror and despair about the world. And my 16-year-old sister, who is a journalist, sat down and she wrote a prose response that was so moving and supportive and loving, and how she and I could change the world, and that it doesn't always have to be like this. And so my parents took those two pieces, my poem and her prose, and were so proud of us. And that was a really big moment in my life that first of all, I felt a little outed, because it was not something that I expected to share so widely. But I got a lot of positive reaction to really raw emotion. That was the beginning for me. And then all through, my young adult life, I wrote poetry. But I decided I wanted to be a children's writer, and I live in the Los Angeles area, and I heard that there was a poet named Myra Cohn Livingston who taught writing poetry for children, and that she was really old. So I thought, oh my God, she's famous and she's going to die. I got to take a class from her really quickly. So I ended up taking classes from her for 12 years. I was very, very lucky, and I was in a group of poets, all of us who've become poetry teachers and kind of spread. Lee Bennett Hopkins, who's a well-known poet and anthologist, calls us Myra's Mafia. But she encouraged us and taught us and was very, very strict about meter and rhythm and taking us back to basics. Had a very clear point of view, and then began to invite us to be in her anthologies. So my first published poem was in a book of hers called Poems for Mothers. And I wanted to send out a birth announcement to all my friends. Someone had to hold me down and said, no, you don't really have to do that. I felt like I was being born with that. But I actually took her class because I wanted to write picture books, and I thought, maybe I will learn how to use language as more of a tool. And I did. I really did feel like that was part of my work towards writing in general.
So a lot of people are intimidated by poetry. Why do you think that is? And do they have any reason to feel that way?
If it feels obscure, if it feels like it has no touchstone for that person, no neuro point where it's like someone touches a nerve for you, then it's going to be meaningless. And I also believe that everybody's different. For example, when I fell in love with my husband, I began to send him love poems, and he never commented. He's very quiet. And years later, I said, well, what did you think about those? And he goes, well, I would read them. I didn't quite get them, and I would put them in my drawer. So, I think there's two possible ways to approach it. One is poetry may not be for that person. But the other is maybe you could start by reading poetry for children, because what Myra taught us is that in poetry for children, you stick with one subject. And if you're writing about oranges and you think of oranges in 3 different ways, maybe it reminds you of your grandmother's hands, maybe it reminds you of the summer by the river, and maybe it reminds you of that wonderful smell of, walking through an orange grove. Choose one of those and write your poem, and then you can write another poem about the others. I think a lot of adult poems have many, many themes. For some people, for me, for example, I just need things to be clear and simple and to be concrete. I really like things that are accessible. For example, I have a lot of earrings, and many of them are specific objects. Like right now I'm wearing carrots, I just like things because it means something to me. In my brain, it rings a bell. And the other thing is maybe to pick up a really wonderful anthology. For example, Paul Bachanesco has a great anthology called Firefly July. It's a year of very short poems. Maybe that's a place to go. Or Valerie Worth is a wonderful poet. She has a collection called All the Small Poems. The other thing, if people are looking for collections, there's a series of books called Poetry Friday Anthologies, edited by Janet Wong and Sylvia Vardell. Sylvia Vardell has a wonderful blog called Poetry for Children, and if you want to get started in poetry, I'd start there. She's always talking about reviewing books and interviewing poets and discussing different poems and how they work together. And they have a series of anthologies that have been adopted by the state of Texas and a lot of other states about poems for middle school, poems about science, in which they present a poem on one page. And for teachers in the teacher edition, this other side of the page are 5 things the teacher can do right then, that moment, on a Friday. They read the poem, and then there are 5 things they could do with their class right then that connect the class to the poem. So you open it up, and there's curriculum. They don't have to think. But I think that those anthologies are very exciting.
Cool. Tell us about your personal tagline. I found this on your website.
Half author, half poet, half not good at fractions.
Right. How did you come up with that, and why?
So, I've been trying to loosen up my personality on the internet. My first website was very journalistic and almost like high heels and a tie, like a briefcase. And my friend Bruce Ballin, who's my best friend, he and I write poems every day and trade them online. And we've been doing that for about 6 years now. And he said, no, you got to relax. You've got to have a personality online. It's like a conversation, April. It's not like you're a reporter. So that was the very beginning of my attempt to be funny, because I wanted to break the ice between me and the people who were reading it. And I actually went online and I looked at tons of taglines, and I adapted someone else's tagline that had said half something, half not something. And I don't remember what that was, but I like that pattern. And that's why I married an accountant. He's the one who's good at fractions.
It makes me think of Car Talk in the third half of the show.
Oh. It's so funny.
So what are you working on next?
I have lots of books in progress, and one of the things that I'm embarrassed to say is that I have a hard time figuring out how to finish books. I'm in a wonderful critique group run by Barbara Botner, but every single one of the people around her magic table could be the leader. Everybody's published, and everybody's a terrific critique person, and they have helped me along the way. One of the books that I did finish on her table was based on the true story of my family farm. My father was a child of Jewish immigrants from Russia, and Jews were not allowed to own land in Russia. So when they came to America, a lot of Russian immigrants became farmers. And they had a 300-acre farm in California. My father became a farmer. And the year after I was born, there was a huge flood that the river broke on our property, and 40 people in the town were killed. And all the buildings, all the orchards, all the pieces of equipment, everything was washed away. And because our property was at the beginning of the flood, that our very rich, dark California soil, which was what made our farm so terrific, was washed over and covered over by sand. And as they were rebuilding the levee to protect the land from further flooding, they had all these tractors, great big tractors going back and forth when the land was still wet. And years later, what we discovered is that pushing down of the wet soil created a layer of soil about 2 feet underground that was still clay and mud. It created this horrible smelling concoction that kept plants from growing. So you could replant your orchard and they grow for about a year, and then their roots would touch that compacted layer of soil and they would die. So my father had to figure out a way to solve that problem, or he had to get out of the business of farming. He contracted a guy who built farm machinery, and they built a huge auger, and an auger is like a huge drill. But they built an auger that was 8 feet tall, and it could drill down 8 feet. My father's plan was he would drill 5 holes for every tree. The first one was in the center where he'd plant the tree. And then the other 4 were like, you would sort of aerate the soil. You'd replace the soil very gently so it could mix back in. And he personally dug 40,000 holes for the new orchard. And the farm flourished. So I rewrote the story from the point of view of a small girl who goes through the flood with her family and the terror of that, and then trying to figure out a solution. And the girl herself is the one who comes up with the beginning of the idea, and they work on it, and sort of the rebuilding of the farm. The story is called Washed Away, and I have been unable to sell it, but I feel that's a promising story. And it's always fun to come up with new ideas. The hard thing for me is finishing them.
Is there anything you would like to talk about that I have not thought to ask you?
So if there are people out there who want to write, and if you think you want to write for children, I would definitely join SCBWI, Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And it's been around for over 40 years. It's in every country. And wherever you live, there are regional SCBWI chapters with people who are so generous. I feel like I grew up in SCBWI. They took me from an aspiring author to a professional author. And they have conferences, and they have one-day events, and they have gatherings where they just trade information, and then they help you join a critique group. So that would be the first thing I would tell people. And then, of course, read lots of picture books if that's what you want to write, or read lots of poetry, or read lots of graphic novels. Read cereal boxes, for God's sake. It doesn't really matter. Whatever appeals to you, that's what you want to sort of fill your head with. I actually love listening to audiobooks because I like to hear how the words sing in the air. You know, if you're near a college, I would try to take a class on writing picture books or writing young adult literature or whatever it is, because there's so many people who are fabulous teachers. Or if you enjoy taking classes online, all of those will help you get started. One of the resources that I refer people to is Harold Underdown's site. It's underdown.org. It's also called The Purple Crayon because his name is Harold, and that harkens back to that wonderful book, Harold and the Purple Crayon. But he's a former children's book editor, and he has a tremendous number of resources and suggestions about agents and ideas of how to set up a manuscript and all sorts of things that in our world is useful to know. I think the other thing, too, though, is we can get too much information, and maybe this comes right back to the idea of being present. It used to be that someone could read all the books in their local library, and now you can't. And so, I don't know about you, but in me that sets up a feeling of like, I'm so slow, and I don't read enough, and I'm not keeping up with this blog, and I can barely read all the books on my bedside table, and it's a very tricky world we're now in, and we're all just inventing it. There's no generation yet that knows how to look back and help us take this next step and how to control this. So sort of understand that what we're being asked to do is unreasonable, and so we've got to figure out what do we need to flourish. So, okay, can I say one more thing? I figured out one more thing. I'm not sure this completely has to do with writing only, but I kept trying to figure out, well, what is my philosophy? What will help me? What is my touchstone? There are two things I do. One is I read a meditation book at night, which is like a paragraph. And I could never remember what I had read the next morning. I would struggle going, wait, what did I read? And so then I thought, well, I'll condense that into one word or one or two words. And I could never remember that. And then I thought, I'll try all the tricks in the book, like make a cartoon in my head. That didn't work either. So finally what I do is I write that one word the night before on the top of my foot in ink. Oh, I get 2 words. This year I gave myself 2 words. If I'm really confused and I don't know what to do or how to approach a problem, or someone calls me on the phone and I'm flustered, I think, what's my word today? And that really helps. My word today, their word in the book was surrender, but I decided to change that to stop fighting. So when I look at my word today, it's a very interesting 2 words, because it not only means stop fighting your demons or whatever it is, but it also might mean stop fighting success. So that's one thing. The other thing is that my mantra for the year is, what will make me feel good? Okay, so that's the question. So if there's a question about what you're going to do, what will make you feel good? Today I had written down all the things I was going to do, and including meditate. And as I was leaving the house, I thought, I really don't have time to meditate. And I thought, well, what would make me feel better? Could you just stop and meditate? Or when someone asks, can they have a ride? And my first thought is, I'm busy. I thought I'd go somewhere. And then my second thought is, what would make me feel better? I could give them a ride. I would feel better about myself. Or am I eating properly? That would make me feel better. It's sort of a touchstone for me. Both my foot, the word for the day is my foot, and the word, the question of the year, what will make me feel better? I think I actually started this because I was listening to that podcast, Note to Self, and they had this touchdown for the week. I wanted to focus more on one topic. I wanted to feel whole as a person, where it really did change the way I think. There's one more thing I learned in that podcast. They were talking to a language expert. He said the word priority, for the first 500 years it was in use, there was no plural for it, because a priority, there's only one. And that blew my mind. For some reason, I just thought, of course. So already we're complicating an issue if we say, well, what are your 5 priorities? Well, no, what is your priority? Right? It's just calming to go, that one thing. What's most important?
Very interesting. I'm going to have to look for this podcast. So, do you want to play your fiddle for us?
Sure, I'd be glad to. But you agreed to something. What did you agree to?
I agreed to sing along.
Okay, let me see if we're still in tune. Oh, much better. Okay.
Hotzianu, Hotzianu, mi Mitzrayim, Hotzianu, mi Mitzrayim, Dayenu, 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 Dayenu.
All right. See, I'm not scared to sing because I do story time. Well, this has been a very fun conversation. So, was there anything else that we missed talking about?
I think we pretty much covered the world. Awesome. I'm just really honored to be on your podcast, and hello to all you listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's great to talk to you.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/bookoflife. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida, at cbiboca.org, and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.